I should like to state at the start that I am not now and never have been a communist.
Ask them if they ever found in me anything except the highest adherence to duty and honor.
If I am lying, I should go to jail. If Mr. Chambers is lying, he should go to jail.
I am not and never have been a communist.
In this cell, there was also Owen J. Lattimore.
All that Senator McCarthy has been trying to do is expose the communists who have infiltrated the Department of the Army.
And let me say that I am honored when people come up to me on the streets, perhaps I don't deserve this honor, and say, you're the man who killed Joe McCarthy.
The rapid decline of the power and prestige of the United States undoubtedly will be recorded by future scholars as one of the most amazing events in history. With the defeat of the Axis powers in 1945, the United States stood at the apex of world leadership. She commanded the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. Her economy bolstered scores of nations. She was respected even by her conquered enemies. But long before the children born in that war could vote, the tide had already turned. And by the time their children had grown, the United States had retreated from victory and was struggling for survival in a hostile world. Her military forces had become inferior to those of her enemies. Her economy was reeling under attack by foreign competitors. She was at the mercy of outside energy sources. Her alliances were crumbling. She was hated and jeered at the United Nations. She had been forced to retreat on every continent, while during that same time, over 70 million people each year were being absorbed by international communism. All of this in less than 2 generations. Now the question is why? The accepted view in many circles is that it just happened that way. There were no particular reasons except the normal changing currents of history in an era of rising expectations. There is, of course, another view, a view that is more skeptical of the supposed blind forces of history, and which sees events as caused by people with motives and goals and long-range plans. This is the conspiratorial view of history, as opposed to the accidental view, and it is the conspiratorial view that we shall present in this program. It's our specific purpose to explore the possibility that America, but by the subversion factor.
The most significant aspect of communist expansion since 1945 is the fact that it has not been accomplished by traditional military force. These countries were not conquered by external invasion of Soviet troops, but by internal terrorism, revolution, and subversion by people who were citizens of each target nation. In 1967, Soviet Premier Brezhnev said, "Marxist-Leninists have always understood that socialism cannot be implanted by one country into another by military force, that it is the product of the internal development of a given society." Brezhnev's predecessor, Nikita Khrushchev, was even more explicit when he said, "I am convinced that tomorrow the red flag will fly over the United States, but we will not fly the flag. It will be the American people themselves." The historical record is clear. The prime directive of communist strategy is conquest. The most important lesson to be learned is that at the time of takeover, the actual number of communists in any country is usually less than 3%, and in many cases, such as the Soviet Union itself, it has been less than 1% of the total population. The place to begin this inquiry, therefore, is to examine the strategy by which a tiny minority can capture control of an existing government. The success of this strategy has been largely the result of 2 factors working together. One is the mobilization of mass action among the non-communist population, demonstrations, general strikes, or insurrection. The other is the paralysis of the target government, the inability to fight back effectively, indecision, delays, blunders. It's not surprising, therefore, to learn that a major part of communist strategy is devoted to techniques for creating exactly these two conditions: mobilization of the masses and paralysis of the government. In August of 1922, at a secluded resort near Bridgman, Michigan, law enforcement officers raided a meeting of the top leaders of the Communist Party of America. Hundreds of secret documents were seized. One of the most revealing of these was a directive from Moscow, signed by members of the Executive Committee of the Communist International. In this document, it was firmly established that the Communist Party of America was not independent, but merely a branch of the international organization under firm control of the Soviets. The directive said, "The ruling of the Communist International must be accepted as obligating every member of the Communist Party of America, minority or majority." Another important document was written by the American communists themselves. It said, "The great mass of the working class cannot be formed into organizations consciously under the control of the communists. The communists, therefore, are compelled to function as an underground party. The Communist Party is obliged to penetrate all existing working class and semi-working class organizations to reach the masses, using these organizations as tools and auxiliaries of the Communist Party." The directive made clear that under favorable circumstances, it would be desirable to allow the Communist Party to come out in the open and to appear as a political party. But then it said, "Even though the Communist Party shall have come above ground, the underground organization remains as the directing organ of the open Communist Party." It's important to realize that the open Communist Party, which offers candidates for public office, is not the real organizational force of the movement. It is merely one of the multitude of surface organizations designed to lead the masses. In some countries, such as France and Italy, where communism is viewed merely as a popular political movement, this may be a major channel of mass influence. But in countries such as West Germany, England, or the United States, where the communist label is not popular, it is through the other surface organizations that the underground seeks control of the masses, while the visible communist apparatus serves as a decoy to lull the electorate into believing that the movement is small and harmless. Manipulation of the public is an important part of communist strategy, but the second and equally important objective is paralysis of the target government. For this to be accomplished, it is necessary for the underground to infiltrate into the government itself.
I was one of the editors of the Student Review, which was a more or less communist communist-controlled student paper, and Edmund Stevens.
Nathaniel Weil joined the Communist Party at Harvard in 1932 after becoming convinced that capitalism was doomed and that the only other alternatives were communism or fascism. Shortly afterward, he obtained employment under the Roosevelt administration in the Department of Agriculture.
After I had been at the job for about a year, when I was 23, I received a telephone call from a voice which simply identified itself as Hal from New York. And Hal asked me to meet him at a restaurant in a part of town which government officials did not frequent. I inferred, of course, that Hal represented the Communist Party. And he told me that his name was Hal Ware. He said the decision has been taken to organize a special secret cell of communists who will be totally separated from the party and will include only those people who are believed to have a big future in the government of the United States. This unit will be under the direct control of the Communist International, and you will have nothing to do with the Communist Party or any member of it. We were under no circumstances to engage in communistic talk. We were not to indoctrinate anybody, and we were not to try to recruit anybody.
A lie on that is not considered a lie. Tell us some of your activities when you were a card-carrying member.
Well, I think they're the usual activities for a communist member, participating in picket lines.
In November of 1945, Elizabeth Bentley revealed to the FBI that for 11 years she had served as an espionage courier between an agent from the Soviet Union and members of the American Underground Organization, most of whom held key positions within the United States government. When she was assigned this position, she was told to destroy her party card and any other documentation that might prove she was a member of the party. In her book entitled Out of Bondage, she describes the instructions of the Soviet agent. He said, "You are now no longer an ordinary communist, but a member of the underground. You must cut yourself off completely from all your old communist friends. You cannot even be known as a liberal and move in progressive circles. Instead, you must pose as an ultra-conservative with a slight leaning toward fascism." Larry Grathwohl became a member of the Weather Underground Organization in 1969 as an undercover operative for law enforcement agencies in Ohio. Before breaking away and testifying in 1970, he had risen to the rank of courier and carried directives from the Central Committee to the operating units within various cities. After explaining how the Weather Underground serves the purposes of the Soviet Union with control exerted through Cuba, he then explained the importance of what are called sleepers in the Soviet underground.
However, I can tell you that while I was with the Weathermen, we had certain people that were recruited out of universities that were not allowed to attend meetings, that were dealt with on an individual basis by the person that recruited them. And the idea was for this person's record to be absolutely clean so that he or she could work themselves into key positions of authority and responsibility and therefore be able to do a lot of damage at the right time. Obviously, it would be best if they were in the government somewhere, but or in public utilities. But really, it was sort of like you go on and make your career as best you can, and when the time comes, we'll let you know. So this person could be a vice president or a president of a corporation, multinational or otherwise. Primarily, it was to keep them out of the limelight and keep their records clean. Law enforcement was an area they'd like some of them to get into.
As a result of the testimony of scores of individuals from within the communist movement, we're able to get a clear picture of one of the most important components of the underground structure. This is the elite corps, the moles in high places. They have special assignments that require deep cover, and they're considered too valuable to risk being exposed, even to the rank and file of dedicated communists who themselves may belong to other parts of the underground. The important question, of course, is to what extent has this communist underground been successful? Lies the history of subversion by bribery, blackmail, or terrorism. But the subversion of government from within government is a gigantic subject by itself, and it is to that history that we shall turn our attention next.
The Communist Party in the United States was officially established in 1919, only 2 years after the Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia. During the following 2 decades, over 100,000 American citizens flocked into the party. Unemployment and economic depression had convinced them that capitalism was crumbling, and a fear of the rising specter of fascism led them to embrace what they believed was the only alternative. By 1941, when the United States and Russia became allies in World War II, many people viewed American communists as merely patriots and socialist dreamers. And it was in this atmosphere of benign acceptance that the party consolidated its penetration into government. In fact, attempts even to investigate communism were firmly opposed at the highest level.
The National Maritime Union was then under control of the communists, it's not now, and they were putting their operatives on ships, and they had a network of intelligence.
Robert Morris, for many years, has been a key figure in the anti-subversion program of the federal government. He was chief counsel to the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and during World War II was the officer in charge of the counterintelligence unit of the 3rd Naval District in Washington. After describing how President Roosevelt had ordered the Navy to allow Communist Party members to serve as radio operators with access to secret military communiques, Mr. Morris then turned to the subject of Soviet defector Viktor Kravchenko.
So we had to meet him clandestinely, and he was with the Soviet Purchasing Commission. And he had with him evidence substantial for that purpose, but instead they were using it to build up a large navy in the post-war period to take on the British and the Americans. And I had to put extensive evidence of that.
When Morris brought this information to the attention of his superiors, he was met with cold indifference, was transferred out of intelligence work, and sent to a battle station in the Pacific.
Went down there and gave him all the evidence because Kravchenko was standing by, ready to give more information. So I thought it was quite a coup. And 2 days later, I received orders to get out of the country with only 2 days' notice. Apparently it came to the attention of the White House. The White House didn't want anyone checking up on what the Russians were doing here.
The Office of Strategic Services, known during the war as the OSS, was created to carry out clandestine operations against the Axis powers. It was headed by General William Donovan. It is now known that Donovan, instead of screening out members of the Communist Party, actually made contact with party functionary Eugene Dennis and recruited OSS personnel directly from communist ranks. In Yugoslavia, the OSS vigorously supported the communist resistance forces under Joseph Broz Tito and cut off all supplies to the anti-communist forces under Draza Mihailovic. At the end of the war, the Nazis attempted to surrender to General Mihailovic and to the Americans, but the Allied command refused the offer and insisted that the surrender must be made only to Soviet troops, thus ensuring that Yugoslavia would be in communist hands. Back in the United States, when the FBI provided General Donovan with evidence that some of his OSS personnel were members of the Communist Party, he replied, "I know they're communists. That's why I hired them." After the end of World War II, the OSS became the CIA.
Roosevelt issued an order to the Civil Service Commission that investigators were forbidden to ask any questions concerning the communist backgrounds or communist affiliations of any applicant for the federal service.
Otto Otepka, for 36 years, was an internal security specialist for the federal government. In 1953, he became chief security evaluator for the State Department.
This included, of course, people in such key components of the government as the Office of Strategic Services. One of the most ridiculous things I ever heard of as a part of the relaxation of the security procedures then in effect by the Roosevelt administration was an attempt by the president to allow the Soviet Union to have an NKVD office in Washington, D.C., while in reciprocity, the United States would be allowed to have a branch of the OSS in Moscow. Now, when one knowledgeable studies the composition of the OSS from its inception, who would be ahead in that situation? Obviously, the Soviet Union.
Why is that?
Well, because of the OSS, as history has now established, was comprised at the very top in key positions with individuals who were sympathetic to the Soviet Union.
Many of the early recruits by such events as the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939, the Soviet invasion of Finland, and the bloody purges by Stalin. The innocent idealists dropped out of the party, but by this time many of their comrades had become hardened revolutionaries and continued to follow. Some of those who left the underground came forward to tell their story, and it is through their testimony that we have learned about those who remained behind. Whittaker Chambers was one of those who broke away. Chambers revealed that for 14 years he had been a dedicated communist and had acted as liaison in Washington for a group of communists who held high-ranking positions in the federal government. Elizabeth Bentley was another one who broke from the party in disillusionment. She had held a position similar to that of Whittaker Chambers and had dealt with many of the same people.
We were getting information from the Army, particularly the Air Corps, from the Treasury, from the State Department, from the OSS, from the CIAA.
Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley described the existence of 3 underground groups, or cells. The oldest of these was the Ware Cell, formed by Harold Ware, an official of the Department of Agriculture. The Silvermaster Cell was under the direction of Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, an official of the Farm Security Administration. And the Perlow Cell was headed by Victor Perlow, an official in the Treasury Department. Over 80 persons were identified by name as part of this espionage network. The following is but a brief sampling from that list. Harry Dexter White, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, First U.S. Director of the International Monetary Fund, author of the Morgenthau Plan for the dismantling of post-war Germany, member of the Advisory Committee of the OSS. Laughlin Curry, Administrative Assistant to President Roosevelt, Specialist on the Far East, Personal Presidential Envoy to China. Harold Glasser, Assistant to Harry Dexter White in the Treasury Department, U.S. Economic Advisor to Foreign Governments, Advisor to Secretary of State George Marshall, helped determine which countries would receive U.S. economic aid. Major William Ullman, United States Air Force, Material and Service Division in the Pentagon, access to restricted military information, document photography specialist for the Silvermaster Cell. Also named were Frank Coe in the Treasury Department, John Apt in the Department of Justice, Nathan Witt, Henry Collins in the Department of Labor, Sonia Gold in a Congressional Investigative Committee, and in the OSS, Maurice Halperin, Donald Niven, Duncan Lee, Helen Tenney, J. Julius Joseph, and Donald Wheeler. But perhaps the best-known name of all was Alger Hiss.
Ask them if they ever found in me anything except the highest adherence to duty and honor. Then the committee can judge and the public can judge whether to believe a self-discredited accuser whose names and aliases are as numerous and as casual as his accusations. The other side of this question is the reliability of the allegations before this committee, the undocumented statements of the man who now calls himself Whittaker Chambers.
I don't hate Mr. Hiss. We were close friends, but we are caught in the tragedy of history. Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting. I've testified against him with remorse and pity.
Alger Hiss began his government career as a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Later was employed in the Department of Agriculture, moved to the State Department, and rose rapidly to the rank of Assistant Secretary of State. Was official advisor to President Roosevelt at Yalta, where major decisions were made affecting the fate of post-war Europe and China. Supervised the writing of the United Nations Charter. Was chairman and acting Secretary General at the founding meeting of the UN. In 1939, was identified as a communist agent by 2 independent sources, the French Intelligence Service and Whittaker Chambers. The reports were ignored and he was promoted. Again, in 1945, was implicated by the testimony of Elizabeth Bentley. Again, the reports were ignored and he was promoted. Was identified a 3rd time in 1946 by a Soviet defector in Canada, and again he was retained and promoted. Finally, after being identified a 4th time by former communist Hedda Massing, was convicted in 1950 for perjury in connection with his denials of espionage activities. Was released from prison in 1954 and began a public campaign to vindicate himself as the victim of a frame-up. In the years following the conviction of Alger Hiss, Nathaniel Weil became yet one more former member of the Soviet underground who testified that to his personal knowledge, Hiss was guilty as charged.
The answer to that is that I attended with Hiss probably, at a guess, 30 meetings of the cell. The cell never contained more than 8 or 10 members while I was in it. And I would also meet them at parties, so that I knew Hiss, even though I did not like him too well. I don't mean I disliked him. I mean he impressed me as a cold, calculating person who had a certain fanaticism about him, a lack of the human qualities that what one likes. But I knew him well, so there was no problem in my mind as to identification.
I was not guilty of any of the things Mr. Chambers charged, except that I knew him briefly.
Were you ever a communist?
No, didn't happen to be.
It is estimated that for every person exposed by the testimony of former communists, there are many more that have remained undetected. Elizabeth Bentley stated in 1952 that while she was in the espionage groups working in Washington under Soviet direction, groups that were so important that not even she was allowed to learn of their identities. Neither of these cells have ever been exposed. In September of 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. Western scientists were stunned because of earlier predictions that Soviet nuclear technology was at least a decade behind the United States. The story of how the Soviets so quickly acquired this technology begins with the American Lend-Lease program during World War II. Great Falls, Montana was the location of the U.S. Air Force Base that was used for Lend-Lease air shipments to Russia. Major George Racy Jordan was the officer in charge of this operation from 1942 to 1944. In his book, From Major Jordan's Diaries, he revealed that in addition to the expected crates of food and machinery, the Soviets also were being sent large numbers of black suitcases, which he was told were diplomatic luggage. Becoming suspicious, on one occasion he conducted a surprise inspection of these suitcases and found every one of them to be filled with such documents as maps of military installations and harbors, blueprints for weapons under development, photocopies of tens of thousands, and countless file folders bulging with official documents of the federal government. Written across the front of one folder were the words, "From Hiss." It contained hundreds of military reports. One suitcase contained scientific and engineering documents, highlighted with such strange-sounding words as fission, cyclotron, proton, neutron, heavy water, uranium. Included also was a map labeled Oak Ridge, Manhattan Engineering District. And attached to these materials was a handwritten note on official White House stationery addressed to Anastas Mikoyan, the number 3 man in the Soviet Union. The note was signed by Harry Hopkins, the American official in charge of the Lend-Lease program, President Roosevelt's personal advisor and friend. In 1943, Hopkins at the White House spoke with Major Jordan by telephone, told him to expedite a special shipment that was coming through and not to make any official record of it. When the mysterious cargo arrived, it was identified as uranium salts. The shipment was sent through, and as requested, no official record was made, except in Major Jordan's diaries. In September of 1945, a Russian code clerk named Igor Guzenko, assigned to the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, approached Canadian officials and asked for political asylum. This is the only photograph of Guzenko ever released to the public, and it was not published until after his death in 1982. While working at the Soviet embassy, Guzenko had become dismayed by the fact that his superiors already were preparing for a new war following the defeat of Germany, a war against the entire non-communist world. As a code clerk, he had access to all secret communiques, and he brought many of these with him to prove the truth of his allegations. Wearing a hood here to preserve his anonymity as a protection against reprisals, Guzenko revealed that there was a group of Canadian citizens with important positions within their government who in reality were agents of the Soviet Union. But the most electrifying disclosure of all was that the network included one of the top scientists working in cooperation with the United States on the atomic bomb project. His name was Dr. he was second in authority only to the head of the Canadian project. He had provided the Soviets with information about the secret test of the bomb, and he had delivered to them actual samples of uranium. When confronted with the evidence, Dr. May confessed that everything Guzenko had revealed was true. Another British scientist on loan to the United States was Dr. Emil Klaus Fuchs, who had been assigned to work at the top-secret facility at Los Alamos, New Mexico. He was one of the few people at that time who had knowledge of how to construct the bomb trigger mechanism. Under questioning, Dr. Fuchs confessed that he also had been working with the Communist underground and that he had given the Soviets drawings and detailed instructions on how to assemble and explode the atomic bomb. The confession of Dr. Fuchs led investigators to an American chemist by the name of Harry Gold, who was the man who hand-delivered the vital documents and drawings to the Soviet Vice Consul in New York. When Gold was confronted with Dr. Fuchs' testimony, he too confessed, and this led to the exposure of a network of American citizens who were in a position to channel top-secret nuclear information into Soviet hands. The trail led to David Greenglass, the man who made the actual drawings of the bomb's trigger mechanism, and to his sister, Ethel Rosenberg, and her husband, Julius, who were convicted and executed for their part in coordinating the espionage operation. At the conclusion of the trial, Federal Judge Irving Kaufman declared that this was the crime of the century. He said, "I have searched my conscience to find some reason for mercy. It is not in my power to forgive you." Also convicted at the same trial was Morton Sobel, who had attempted escape to Mexico to avoid prosecution. And finally, the trail of espionage led to Professor Philip Morrison, who admitted earlier Communist Party membership and who had access to virtually all secrets of the A-bomb while employed at the Manhattan Project. In retrospect, it is now clear that the detonation of the Soviets' first nuclear weapon in 1949 was an achievement not of research and science, but of espionage and subversion. Following the disclosure of the Soviet theft of America's nuclear technology, congressional committees began to take an interest in learning more about communist penetration into government. In 1947, for example, Louis Boudens was called to testify before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. He had served as the managing editor of the official communist newspaper, The Daily Worker, and had been a member of the party's national committee. Boudens later revealed that one of the government's most respected experts on China, Owen Lattimore, was a member of the communist underground.
In this cell, there was also Owen J. Lattimore. This I know from reports received in the Politburo and given to me officially as managing editor of the Daily Worker.
Owen Lattimore was the man who was sent to China by President Roosevelt to serve as the official U.S. advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist Chinese leader who then was struggling to prevent a communist takeover of his country. John Stuart Service was another State Department China expert who came under investigation. In 1945, Service was found responsible for transmitting hundreds of classified and top-secret documents to the staff of Amerasia magazine, a communist-controlled publication. There they were copied and transmitted to the Soviet Union. Service was reprimanded for indiscretion, but not released from employment. In fact, he was later promoted to head of the State Department's Information Service. The Senate Subcommittee on Investigations uncovered evidence of similar problems in the Government Printing Office, where many classified documents are printed and distributed. Also in the Voice of America program, which was designed to reflect the American viewpoint through radio broadcasts in Europe. And in the American Overseas Libraries, which were part of the State Department program, supposedly to combat communist propaganda abroad. The CIA and its predecessor, the OSS, came into the spotlight on numerous occasions. In 1952, the head of the CIA, General Walter Bedell Smith, stated publicly that he was sure there were communist agents working inside his organization. No less than 3 defectors from the Soviet KGB have stated that this is so. They are Anatol Golitsyn, Yuri Nosenko, and Mikhail Golanevsky. Although their testimony has been clouded by controversy, the fact remains that there never has been an outside investigation of subversion in the CIA. The military is another critical branch of government that never has been investigated for possible communist penetration, even though there is evidence that serious problems may exist. In Italy, for example, in 1967, Giorgio Rinaldi confessed that he had been part of a Soviet underground operation involving 300 officers in NATO, some of whom were American military officers. In 1954, Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Rastorov of the Soviet Secret Police sought political asylum in the West. He had been the director of Soviet espionage operations in Tokyo. After coming to the United States, he revealed that he personally had worked with several members of the American Military Intelligence Service. In 1964, Swedish Air Force Colonel Stig Wennerstrom admitted that for 14 years he had transmitted information to the Soviets regarding nuclear strike capabilities of NATO and the United States. When asked where he obtained this information, he replied that it was from the head of the American Intelligence Service at the Pentagon. Turning to the legislative branch of government, Senator Barry Goldwater in 1975 was interviewed on television and revealed that communists had infiltrated into the office staffs of as many as 9 members of Congress. This information, he said, came from the CIA commission of which Vice President Rockefeller was a member.
I was told when I was flying to the funeral of Chiang Kai-shek with Vice President Rockefeller that his committee had learned of instances where the offices of senators had been infiltrated by Soviet agents or Soviets or something. I said, "Are you going to publish that?" He said he would, but it was never published. I asked him once why it wasn't. He said, "I was requested not to publish it." Now that you've asked me, I'm going to...
It was never revealed who requested the Vice President not to release these findings. Infiltration into legislative staffs is a major accomplishment for the Soviets. But even more important is the placement of agents into the legislature itself, men who are legally elected to office. In 1961, the House Committee on Un-American Activities published a report entitled "The New Role of National Legislative Bodies in the Communist Conspiracy." This report revealed that a number of communists, posing as Republicans or Democrats, had been successfully elected to the state legislature of Washington, the Michigan Senate, and the United States Congress, and that the Communist Party had boasted of its role in helping to elect candidates in a number of states, including California, Ohio, New York, and Illinois.
By the mid-1950s, the underground apparatus of the Communist Party was in serious trouble. The one thing a conspiracy cannot survive is exposure. Yet a steady stream of former communists and FBI undercover operatives gradually was exposing the entire operation to public view. This was accomplished primarily through congressional investigative committees, which put the testimony of these people into the public record. Now, one of the most important aspects of this history is the fact that even though the President and the heads of various government agencies repeatedly were informed by the FBI and given names with documented proof, almost never were these Soviet agents removed, and in fact many of them were promoted until the investigative committees of Congress stepped in, made the information public, and created external pressure for action. As far as the communists were concerned, something had to be done to stop these committees. And it is the story of how they succeeded in that counterattack that we shall take up next.
There's no contest between Senator McCarthy and the Department of the Army. All that Senator McCarthy has been trying to do is expose the communists who have infiltrated the Department of the Army.
The late Senator Joseph McCarthy, in the minds of many, has become the symbol of anti-communism in America. His detractors have used the word McCarthyism to mean political hysteria and lack of concern for the rights and reputations of innocent people. His defenders view him as the fallen warrior against the hordes of pro-communists in both government and the press. It's not our purpose here to retell the McCarthy saga, but it is important to observe in passing that McCarthy's critics seldom have challenged his basic facts, choosing instead to condemn him on questions of 205 security risks in the State Department. No one denied that such people were on the payroll, but they attacked him because he was not always consistent with the number of names on his list. When he said that there were pro-communist books in the overseas library program, there was no question of it, but he was condemned instead for book burning. No one denied his claim that security risks were employed at the secret testing laboratories at Fort Monmouth, but they criticized him for obtaining this information from a document he was not authorized to have. And when he charged that General Ralph Zwicker had protected and promoted a known communist in the military, his facts were never challenged. He was attacked instead for losing his temper and speaking harshly to a brigadier general.
You hear all this talk about Senator McCarthy's methods, usually in a derogatory sense, like people saying, well, I agreed with his fight against communism and his goals, but I didn't agree with his methods.
In 1951, Roy Cohn had served as the assistant federal prosecutor in the trial of atomic bomb spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. But from 1953 to 1955, he was the chief counsel for the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, of which Senator McCarthy was chairman.
Somebody like Bill Buckley will take the position that, well, his controversiality maybe in the long run hurt the cause and things like that. I don't buy that. Somebody had to make this fight. Senator after senator had declined to do it. It was a dangerous fight because, as we've discussed, you were taking on the media, you were taking on people with vested interests in covering up these communist activities, and it took a man who was a man to do it. And Senator McCarthy was that man. So you can say by his fearlessness and his courage, he made himself an open target for the enemy. Well, that's true. I suppose he did. But that was a risk of the game which he was willing to take and which I think the results he achieved. And I, again, keep coming back to where we are today, because you have to view everything in perspective. If the communists had turned out to be a bunch of pussycats who held free elections in Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria and so on and so forth, and who never went near Afghanistan, or who embraced solidarity and said, you want freedom, you've got it, I'd look like an awful fool today, and I wish I did. But unfortunately, history has proved the opposite, that what we were yelling about 25 years ago has all come true, and there isn't that much left of the free world.
Regardless of the controversy surrounding the career of Joseph McCarthy, regardless and above all others, the destruction of his political career and the placement of the word McCarthyism into the American vocabulary was the turning point in the fortunes of the Soviet underground. From that moment forward, any outspoken anti-communist could be discredited in the public mind merely by labeling him a McCarthyite. The next phase of the campaign against internal security was to convince the general public that communism is not an internal threat to the United States, but that investigative agencies of our own government are. Members of the Soviet underground have worked diligently to promote this point of view through a host of non-communist organizations which they control. Their public pronouncements do not call for the defense of communism, which would be unpopular, but instead for the protection of civil liberties, freedom of association, and the right to political dissent. One of the first organizations to serve this function was the American Civil Liberties Union. It was formed in 1920 by Roger Baldwin, who publicly advocated the right to overthrow the government by force and violence. He also said, "I am for socialism, disarmament, and ultimately the abolishing of the state itself. Communism is, of course, the goal." In a letter to an associate, Baldwin gave this advice. He said, "We want also to look like patriots in everything we do. We want to get a good lot of flags, talk a great deal about the Constitution and what our forefathers wanted to make of this country, and to show that we are the folks that really stand for the spirit of the Constitution." Among the founding membership of the ACLU were such notables as William Foster, who later became the head of the above-ground Communist Party, USA, Felix Frankfurter, who later became a Supreme Court justice, Dr. Harry Ward, of the spokesman for the Communist Party. It was inevitable that the ACLU would become the first non-communist organization to oppose the investigative committees. It carried out a public opinion campaign in favor of the censure of Senator McCarthy, and by 1960 had made the abolition of the House Committee on Un-American Activities one of its primary objectives. One of the functions of the ACLU is to provide free legal services. Most of its officials are lawyers, and many of them belong to an organization known as the National Lawyers Guild. The National Lawyers Guild was formed in 1937 with the assistance of the American branch of an agency of the Soviet Comintern. It has been described by the communists themselves as a transmission belt for the Soviet underground. A committee of Congress officially declared it to be the legal bulwark of the Communist Party. Members of the National Lawyers Guild have provided legal defense and, in some cases, financial assistance to such groups as the Weather Underground Organization, the Puerto Rican FALN terrorists, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, and the Symbionese Liberation Army. In 1975, William Kunstler and other members of the National Lawyers Guild offered their support to the leaders of the West German terrorist Red Army Fraction, better known as the Baader-Meinhof Gang. They even attempted to send a team of lawyers to Germany to aid in their legal defense. One of the members of that team was Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General of the United States. Perhaps the most conspicuous group within the National Lawyers Guild has been the New York law firm of Rabinowitz, Boudin, and Standard. Leonard Boudin is the father of Kathy Boudin, one of the leaders of the Weather Underground Organization. Victor Rabinowitz, his law partner, has been identified as a member of the Communist Party, and their law firm is an official agent of Cuba in United States courts. By the early 1950s, the Communist Party had launched 3 additional organizations designed to build public opposition to the investigation of communism. The first of these fronts was called the Civil Rights Congress, which used the theme of defending minority rights as a means of raising money for the legal defense of Communist Party leaders. The second was the National Committee to Abolish the Un-American Activities Committee, in which 7 of the 13 national officers were identified members of the Communist Party. The third was the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, officially cited in 1958 as a communist front. Frank Wilkinson has been an organizer for both the National Committee to Abolish the Un-American Activities Committee and the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee. On 2 separate occasions, he has been identified in congressional hearings as a member of the Communist Party. Wilkinson currently is head of a new organization, the National Committee Against Repressive Legislation, and is sought after as a public speaker, particularly on college campuses, where he is presented merely as an advocate of civil liberties. Let us turn now to an actual event to see how these people and organizations have been able to achieve their objective. The event was a public hearing before the House Committee on Un-American Activities held in San Francisco on May 12, 1960. The purpose of the hearing was to gather testimony regarding the influence of the Communist Party in the San Francisco area. Frank Wilkinson is one of the first organizers to arrive on the scene. Working through a group, American Freedoms, he helps coordinate the distribution of thousands of copies of his speech by Congressman James Roosevelt, in which the House Committee on Un-American Activities.
Well, have you had anything to do with the demonstrations in front of the City Hall today?
No, I've just been an observer of those.
I understand.
Wilkinson and other members of the Soviet apparatus in California formulate a 4-point strategy for attack against the committee. First, they will generate public opposition to the hearing. Secondly, they will pack the hearing room with people who are hostile to the committee, drawing heavily upon radicalized students from the university. Third, they will disrupt the hearing with tactics of open defiance, forcing the police to use crowd control measures to reestablish order. Fourth, they will treat the utilizing news coverage of the action as evidence that repressive measures are used against innocent protesters. The packing of the hearing room comes off exactly as planned. The handful crowd that comes not to listen, but to protest. When the room is filled to capacity and hundreds are turned away, communist agitators seize upon this as a propaganda device to disrupt the meeting. From left to right, we see Ralph Izzard, Archie Brown, Sally Etarian Sweet, and Saul Wachter.
Open the doors! Open the doors! What are you hiding? What are you hiding? We have nothing to hide. What are you hiding? Let the people in out here. You want America? Then get out, you want America. That's what you should do. Pack up and get out. You are. Open the doors. Here comes the Goose Squad. This is Americanism. Watch this Americanism in action. Wow, watch this Americanism in action. Watch this American.
Douglas Wachter, son of Sal Wachter, is a communist-trained student organizer at the Berkeley campus of the University of California. He also was an official delegate to the Communist Party's recent annual convention. Pleading the Fifth Amendment when asked about his party membership, he presents himself not as an agent of a foreign power, but as a patriot whose only concern is to defend the Constitution.
I cannot cooperate with the committee in answering any such questions. I feel I have an obligation as a citizen of this country to preserve the Constitution, and I do not feel I can do so in good conscience by allowing the House Un-American Activities Committee to inquire into my beliefs or associations.
On the second day of the hearings, California State Assemblyman Philip Burton addresses a rally of protesters and calls for the abolition of the committee. His sister-in-law, Michelle Burton, was an official delegate to the 1962 Communist World Youth Festival in Helsinki. Burton himself has established a long record of support for officially cited Communist Front organizations. Philip Burton later would become a member of the United States Congress. William Mandel is a well-known news commentator over radio station KPFA. In due course, he is called to testify about evidence of his role in the Communist Party as an instructor in tactics.
If you think that I am going to cooperate with this collection of Judases, of men who sit there in violation of the United States Constitution, if you think I will cooperate with you in any way, you are insane. This question has no purpose other to harass me. When I was asked this question last in 1943 by the late Joe McCarthy, and let me say that I am honored when people come up to me on the streets, perhaps I don't deserve this honor, and say, you're the man who killed Joe McCarthy. Because I happened to appear on the first day of the book-burning hearing, and I did my best to conduct myself in the manner which I'm conducting myself today. If there were any such evidence against me under any law, the proper authorities could move against me. This body is improperly constituted. It is a kangaroo court. It does not have my respect. It has my utmost contempt. And I am not going to answer that question, sir.
By noon of the second day, the unruly crowd has grown to such proportions that it now blocks access to other rooms in the City Hall, and the jeering and chanting interfere with proceedings in courtrooms on the third floor. It is inevitable that the judges are compelled to register official complaints with the police, who now have no choice but to ask the demonstrators to leave. Taking orders from their leaders, the crowd refuses to budge, even in the face of fire hoses. The result is a media event of great proportions, as the protesters are unceremoniously removed, one by one. The final phase of the strategy, as you recall, was to force the police into using crowd control measures, which then could be offered as evidence of alleged police-state brutality against innocent and peaceful demonstrators. And so it was. The People's World, the official communist newspaper in San Francisco, prepared a special supplement which was widely distributed on college campuses and to waterfront workers. Thousands of leaflets also were distributed entitled "From Blackmail to Blackjack." The leaflets said that students were peacefully demonstrating and defending the most cherished American freedoms when fire hoses, clubs, and blackjacks were used against them, without warning and without provocation, to browbeat and smash the public opposition to the House Committee on Un-American Activities. The same theme, in one variation or another, also was carried in much of the nation's non-communist press. Well, that was 1960. By the 1970s, the campaign against internal security had greatly expanded in terms of the number of people and organizations involved, in terms of professionalism and sophistication, and also in terms of objectives, because by this time, the target of attack had broadened to include not only the investigative committees of Congress, but all intelligence gathering operations. In our next program, The Open Gates of Troy.
What they were doing there was making bombs. They were making anti-personnel bombs. They were taking 4 or 5 sticks of dynamite, hundreds of heavy nails, and taping the nails on the outside of the dynamite so that when it exploded, it would send those nails out in every direction, and of course, any one like a bullet. So they would have killed hundreds of people had they been successful.
But because of my activities and other people's activities, the weathermen had to spend a lot of time trying to determine who the informants were, who the police agents were, and this distracted them from their goals.
The 2 disinformation departments, again under the supervision of the Soviets, decided to start a long-term operation against the CIA.
I believe in the naming of the names of CIA people working abroad.
I think anybody who thinks that the Communist Party of the United States is a serious threat to the security of the United States in any way.
Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
In the 1st century BC, it was the Roman poet Virgil who immortalized the story of the Trojan horse. After 10 years of warfare, the Greeks hadn't been able to breach the impenetrable walls around the Trojan city of Troy. Finally, they devised a scheme for accomplishing through trickery what they could not achieve by military might. They built a large wooden statue of a horse and placed it outside the city gates, supposedly as an offering to the gods and a tribute to the Trojans, who were led to believe within its wooden belly. That night, while the Trojans slept with pleasant dreams of peace, the soldiers crept from their hiding place, overpowered the few sentries who remained on guard, and from the inside opened the gates of Troy. Legions of warriors waiting on the outside rushed into the defenseless city, and roaming through the streets at will, massacred the population. When they left, it is said that every building had been destroyed, and no living thing remained behind. Now, there is much in common between the ancient city of Troy and the United States of America. In the past, our walls have been impenetrable against the armies of all hostile foreign powers. But now we're told that there no longer is any danger, because our enemy has mellowed and gone. Is it possible that we too have been lulled into pleasant dreams of peace, while there are those who even now overpower our sentries and pull upon our gates from the inside? The answer to that question is the subject of this program.
In Part 1, entitled Moles in High Places, we posed the proposition that America's retreat from victory since the end of World War II was the result not of a confusion factor, but of the subversion factor. We reviewed the official Soviet strategy for utilizing subversion as a method of conquest from within. We took a look at the record of early communist success in penetrating into the highest levels of our government. We saw how these disclosures were met with indifference or hostility from the executive branch, the courts, and Congress itself. We saw men who were blatant security risks continue to rise in federal employment. And finally, we documented the process by which the Soviet underground in the 1960s launched a successful campaign to disrupt and discredit the investigative committees of Congress. By the 1970s, the drive against internal security was ready for the next stage of development. In June of 1971, Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo of the RAND Corporation were charged with espionage and theft of government property when they delivered for publication certain highly classified documents, which became known as the Pentagon Papers. The publishing of these documents provided the Soviets with an effective anti-American propaganda weapon in Southeast Asia, and also gave them the key to our secret diplomatic code, a key they could use to decipher hundreds of older messages recorded and stored for just such a breakthrough. Ellsberg and Russo claimed that freedom of the press gave them the right to obtain and publish these documents. A team of National Lawyers Guild attorneys was assembled for their defense, and the head of this team was Leonard Boudin of the law firm Rabinowitz, Boudin and Standard, a registered agent of Cuba. Also active in the defense was an organization called the Institute for Policy Studies. Sometimes described as a think tank for the left, the Institute for Policy Studies is headquartered in Washington, D.C. It has served as a clearinghouse for disgruntled or disloyal government employees to leak information to the press that will damage our diplomatic or military operations in other countries. One of the founders of the Institute for Policy Studies was Richard Barnett. In his book, Intervention and Revolution, Barnett describes communist movements and terrorist campaigns around the world as being merely local struggles for power with no connection to the Soviet Union. It is Barnett's position that the Soviet KGB is not aggressive in these activities and that local communist leaders are independent of Moscow. In his book entitled The Economy of Death, he wrote, "If a country in Asia, Africa, or Latin America goes communist, the Soviet Union or China does not necessarily benefit. Revolutionary regimes, even communist ones, do not make the United States any weaker militarily or the communist powers any stronger." One of the goals of the Institute for Policy Studies has been to weaken and neutralize the CIA. This is also a goal of the KGB. In spite of the fact that the CIA already may have been compromised by communist agents within its ranks, and in spite of the fact that in many countries it has supported the worst possible non-communist leaders among the contenders, still, in some countries, the CIA has done much to slow down communist progress. And as long as it remains in operation, there is always a chance that it could do great future damage to Soviet plans.
I believe in the naming of the names of CIA people working abroad, or in the United States for that matter, because I think that people around the world ought to know, as a matter of principle, with whom they're dealing. That is, if they're dealing...
The name of Philip Agee has become synonymous with the drive against the CIA. Agee had been a CIA operations officer in Latin America. He resigned in 1969 and began work on his book entitled Inside the Company, CIA Diary, which became an international bestseller in 1975. The theme of his book was simple. The CIA is on the side of evil, engaged in a senseless and cruel campaign against an imaginary threat of communism. Agee frankly supports the activities of the KGB and even complains that the Soviets are not doing enough in the area of secret operations. In the conclusion of his book, Agee revealed his personal ideology. He said, "Reforms of the FBI and the CIA." In the June 1975 issue of Esquire magazine, Agee was even more blunt when he said, "I aspire to be a communist and a revolutionary." In 1977, Agee was deported from Britain for his activities on behalf of the KGB. One of the persons who came to his legal defense was Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General of the United States. As early as 1974, Philip Agee had become associated with a periodical called Counterspy, which published the names and addresses of CIA officers stationed in other countries.
I believe that by exposing the identities of CIA officers abroad, it will make it that much harder for presidents of the United States, through the CIA, to install the Pinochets of today and tomorrow.
One of the names published by Counterspy was Richard Welch, attached to the U.S. Embassy in Athens, Greece. Shortly after his name was revealed, Welch was ambushed and killed by local terrorists. Similar assassination attempts have been made on U.S. officials in other countries immediately following the public disclosure of their names. In July of 1978, Philip Agee traveled to Cuba to participate in the 11th Communist World Youth Festival. While there, he announced the formation of a new publication called the Covert Action Information Bulletin. An editorial in the first issue stated, "We will never stop exposing CIA personnel and operations whenever and wherever we find them." It's likely that some of the names released by the Covert Action Bulletin actually were CIA officers working under cover of other occupations, but many were not. In fact, one source for acquiring these names was the Soviet disinformation departments of East Germany and Czechoslovakia. One of the men responsible for compiling this list before seeking political asylum in the West was Vladislav Dittman, the officer in charge of the Department of Disinformation in Czechoslovakia.
The two disinformation departments, again under the supervision of the Soviets, decided to start a long-term operation against the CIA, making life as hard as possible for CIA. That is to label many American diplomats, politicians, cultural representatives abroad as CIA agents and paralyze their positions. Specifically in 1966, the first major operation was to prepare a book which is called Who is Who in CIA. Shortly after coming to the United States, I found this book in many bookstores. I have it at home. Covert Action Bulletin, or
is this AG's group, the group?
Yes, that's right. It's one of the major sources of information about CIA man. That's, of course, that's ironic because that is a communist disinformation.
Another anti-security organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. is called Security Studies. It is directed by Morton Halperin, who traveled to England with Ramsey Clark to assist in the legal defense of Philip Agee. Halperin previously had been employed in the National Security Council as the senior assistant to Henry Kissinger. Halperin, in fact, was the man who personally prepared the Pentagon Papers for the government before they were illegally transmitted to the press. Later, he spent 5 months working with Leonard Boudin and other members of the National Lawyers Guild as a special consultant in the defense of Ellsberg and Rousseau. Mr. Halperin has become another prominent spokesman for the point of view that there is no threat of communism, that we can best combat the secret operations of the KGB by ourselves doing everything in the open, and that there is no need for us to be concerned over Marxist-Leninist movements in any country.
Absurd. The notion that there is a Marxist-Leninist conspiracy in the world, in light of the very, very substantial differences between various countries who call themselves Marxist-Leninists, is absurd. I think the only people left who take Marxist-Leninism seriously are American right-wingers who have a need for seeing a conspiracy opposed to them. And I think
during our interview, Mr. Halperin remained soft-spoken and composed while discussing questions of civil liberties and constitutional rights. But when we asked him about the Communist Party connections of his associate Leonard Boudin, this was his reply.
That's absolute nonsense, and you know that's absolute nonsense. Mr. Boudin can speak for himself about his past affiliations, but I think that's, first of all, totally irrelevant to the question of the defense of Daniel Ellsberg, and also absolute nonsense.
Leonard Boudin has been a member of the National Lawyers Guild probably for the last 30 to 35 years. He's been...
Mr. John Reese is editor and publisher of Information Digest, an internationally recognized bi-weekly report specializing in matters of Soviet covert operations against the United States and the free world.
It's very interesting to note that in the trial of William Miller and Mark Felt, who were two senior officials of the FBI, harassed in the courts under the Carter administration for their efforts to stop terrorism, a stipulated document was entered into the court record which said that Leonard Boudin had been a secret member of the Communist Party USA. Now, I think this is important, Mr. Griffin, that it was a stipulated document, and that in legal terms, I understand, is one that was agreed by both the attorneys for the defense and for the prosecution.
Mr. Halperin denies that the Communist Party is an arm of international conquest. He portrays it as merely another political party, interested only in sharing power, not capturing it.
I think the Communist Party is, like the Republican Party, a political party. I think there may have been people in it as there may have been people in other political groups who took orders from foreign powers and who may have violated some laws of the United States. And if they did, the government has a right to investigate them.
Anyone can become a Republican or Democrat. Could anyone join the Communist Party?
I did not understand the function of this interview was to discuss the Communist Party, and I don't think I have anything useful to say on the subject.
Now these people come up and they advocate something, but they don't advocate it as a communist. They advocate it as a distinguished professor or a former Foreign Service officer or somebody who served in the National Security Council, and they're taken at face value with what they're saying. And they are succeeding in making a wrong presentation of the state of the world today. And I say give them all the liberty in the world, but identify them so that when they do talk, we know who they are and that it's the voice of Moscow speaking and not the voice of our American academe.
In January of 1977, Morton Halperin became chairman of a new organization called the Campaign for Political Rights. It was launched at a 3-day meeting held in Chicago, sponsored by the National Lawyers Guild. When we asked Mr. Halperin about the role played by the National Lawyers Guild, again he became upset by the question.
I think when you attempt by asking questions about was the Campaign for Political Rights started by the Lawyers Guild, which will then be followed by a question of did I know that the Lawyers Guild was named by the California Un-American Activities Committee as a communist front, that the only conceivable purpose of such questions is to attempt to smear organizations and to discredit their work by tenuous and illegitimate connections which are absolutely irrelevant to what they're doing and can serve no other purpose than pure McCarthyism.
That brings us up to date in terms of the more prominent individuals and organizations which have been working to dismantle our internal security system. The names have changed over the years, but the methods and the rhetoric have not. Now, in spite of the fact that this campaign has been going on now for well over 30 years, and in spite of the fact that it enjoys the backing of a major foreign power with almost unlimited funding and full-time professional leadership, still, many Americans are of the opinion that somehow we have survived the attack. Surely someone in government is watching these things. That, of course, is a comforting thought, but unfortunately it is not a reflection of reality. We shall take a hard look at that reality in the next part of this program.
We Americans do not like to hear criticism of our presidents, especially if we personally have voted for them. It is as though our ballot somehow has sanctified these politicians and converted them into sages and saints. But the fact remains that presidents from both political parties have contributed to the undermining of our internal security system, and we cannot sweep these facts under the rug merely because the men involved have been politically popular. The role played by FDR in opening up government employment to communists in the 1930s and 40s previously has been shown. When Roosevelt died in 1945, Harry Truman stepped into the presidency, but made few changes regarding internal security. In fact, Mr. Truman was upset by the exposure of Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Harry Dexter White, especially when it was learned that Truman had promoted him after being told by the FBI that White was a communist. The president also was outspoken against the investigation of Alger Hiss and dismissed the issue as being merely a red herring. To prevent a repeat of these exposures, he issued orders forbidding the entire executive branch of government from giving to congressional committees any information contained in employee personnel records. This included the State Department. Although President Eisenhower had been elected to office partly on his campaign against subversion in government, employees of the executive branch to turn over to Congress any information regarding questions of internal security. With this single act, one of the main sources of information about subversion in government suddenly was cut off. The Supreme Court also has played an important role in the destruction of our internal security. For example, in 1956, communist organizer Steve Nelson was sentenced to prison for violating the Pennsylvania Sedition Act. But then the Supreme Court ruled that the Pennsylvania law was unconstitutional because supposedly it had been superseded by the federal Smith Act. this decision struck down the existing internal security laws of 42 states. Then, in a second decision, the Supreme Court declared that provisions of the Smith Act were null and void. In 1964 and 1965, the court struck down the laws that required American communists to register as agents of a foreign power. The justices did not deny that these people really did act as agents of the Soviet Union, but they declared that compelling them to register as such would violate their constitutional rights. These are but a sampling of over 30 decisions of the Supreme Court, mostly under the leadership of Chief Justice Warren, which have made it impossible to prosecute or even to investigate subversion in government. The Warren Court now is gone, but those who followed have not challenged these decisions, and the damage remains unrepaired. Another setback to our internal security program was the selection process by which government employees who administered that program were assured of being of a liberal or pro-Soviet point of view. Those who adhered to a hard line on security were eliminated, such as Otto Otepka, Chief Security Evaluator for the State Department. Shortly after the election of President Kennedy, Otepka was called to meet with Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Attorney General Robert Kennedy.
They asked me about my attitudes and policies and procedures with respect to the administration of personnel security administration in the State Department under the new Kennedy administration. And I was given a specific case, and that was on Walt Whitman Rostow. I was asked whether or not it would be possible for Rostow to come into the State Department without the benefit of a background investigation.
Otepka replied that he could not issue a clearance for Walt Rostow because he already had been investigated by the CIA and the Air Force, and on both occasions was found not to be suitable for employment because of security questions.
This made the Secretary, and particularly Bobby Kennedy, very unhappy, and Kennedy said, in referring to the decision of the Air Force to turn Rostow down on a prior occasion, he said, "Those Air Force generals who did this are a bunch of jerks."
Shortly after this meeting took place, Walt Rostow, the man who was denied a security clearance by the CIA, the Air Force, and the State Department, was appointed by President Kennedy to be his special assistant in none other than national security affairs. The Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs under the Kennedy administration was Harlan Cleveland. Cleveland had approached Otepka to see if there was some way to get Alger Hiss back into the State Department after his release from prison. Cleveland himself had been hired only after the Security Evaluations Division had been ordered from above to waive the usual pre-employment security check of his background. Cleveland was responsible for selecting a special committee of 10 experts to rewrite the internal security procedures for Americans employed at the UN.
They were all allies and associates of Alger Hiss. The 10 people that I mentioned earlier, who Cleveland wanted on his committee to reform security procedures. They reformed them all right. They abolished them.
In 1963, Otto Otepka was called to testify before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. One of the disclosures made in that testimony was the case of William Wieland. Wieland had been a State Department officer in charge of Cuban affairs. He played a key role in shaping the U.S. pro-Castro policy during the critical days of Castro's takeover in Cuba. Otepka had discovered that Wieland, at the time of obtaining employment in the State Department, had concealed information about his past, including an unresolved allegation that he had been connected with the Cuban Communist Party. Otepka also discovered that Wieland had concealed evidence that Castro was a communist.
There was just a preponderance of evidence showing that Fidel Castro was a communist. Yet, William Wieland was advising his superiors, John Foster Dulles, and then when he died, Christian Herter, that there was no evidence that Castro was a communist, and that we should seek an accommodation with Castro and get rid of that right-wing dictator, Batista. When all of this was brought out in my evaluation report, I found out, that is, that Wieland had his supporters upstairs who immediately came to his rescue, who didn't want these facts to come out, who didn't want...
The strategy of the State Department was to force Otepka's resignation. his file's assignment was to index the congressional record. But Otto Otepka did not yield to these pressures, and his superior, who had ordered the tapping of his telephone, was the one who was forced to resign. In the end, Otepka was vindicated. But conditions in the State Department did not change. William Whelan was promoted, and Otepka never again served as security evaluator, nor in fact did anyone else. The job itself was abolished. Part of the responsibility for screening employees of the State Department was transferred to the Civil Service Commission. But the Civil Service Commission had stopped even asking questions about employee loyalty to the United States. According to the Supreme Court, such questions are now unconstitutional.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The Watergate scandal that engulfed President Nixon in 1974 proved to be an unexpected source of help to the campaign against internal security. With the public preoccupied with stories of unethical behavior of White House officials, it became easier to sell the idea that the real threat to America was not from communist subversion, but from our own government. In Congress, this attitude was expressed by an increasing support for legislation to abolish the House Committee on Un-American Activity. Backlash, the pro-abolition forces were easily defeated when the issue came to a vote. In 1974, the final vote was only 86 in favor of abolition, with 247 against. But the following January, a change in the procedures of the House of Representatives placed into the hands of the Democratic caucus the power to appoint committee chairmen and to establish House voting rules. The man elected as chairman of the Democratic caucus that year was Congressman Philip Burton, the same man who 15 years earlier had helped to lead the disruption of the House committee hearings in San Francisco. Burton wasted no time in using the power of his new position. With the help of Congressman Robert Drinan, a Catholic priest from Massachusetts, and with other longtime foes of the committee, he drafted a measure to abolish it. This was not in the form of proposed legislation that, as in the past, could be openly debated, but as one of the new operating rules of the House. As such, it could not be singled out. All the rules had to be accepted or rejected as a single package. A no vote would have paralyzed Congress until a new package could be rewritten. Many congressmen who favored the continuance of the committee were unwilling to delay the opening of Congress, and others were equally unwilling to vote against their own party caucus. And so, on January 14, 1975, the House Committee on Internal Security ceased to exist. After the vote, Congressman Drinan was recognized on the floor of the House and introduced into the congressional record a tribute to Communist Party member Frank Wilkinson for his efforts on behalf of the successful abolition campaign. With the elimination of the House Committee, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee became the only anti-subversion investigative body left in Congress. But it too had powerful foes. The committee actually was the subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee. One of the members of the Judiciary Committee was in March of 1977, Kennedy finally succeeded in gathering enough support to cut off all funding for the Internal Security Subcommittee. Abolished by lack of funding, there have been no hearings and no investigations since that date. Once the investigating committees of Congress had been silenced, the FBI became the primary target of attack. One of the first moves in this campaign was to destroy the prestige and morale of FBI agents by publicly charging them with criminal activities. This had long been a tactic of the ACLU and the National Lawyers Guild, but it wasn't until the Justice Department of the federal government assumed this task that the strategy became effective. In April of 1978, Mark Felt, formerly the number 2 man in the FBI, and Edward Miller, his assistant in charge of the Domestic Intelligence Division, were indicted in federal court. The purpose of these entries was to search for information that would reveal the whereabouts of terrorists who were known to be responsible for bombings in New York and Washington. Another purpose was to discover the planned locations of future bombs so they could be intercepted and destroyed beforehand. FBI Associate Director Mark Felt tells the story.
In March of 1970, a luxury townhouse in Greenwich Village, New York, blew up. It was a tremendous explosion. And as an interesting sidelight, out of the smoking and dust and rubble ran two females. One was completely naked, and the other had a pair of jeans. That was the Kathy Wilkinson and Catherine Boudin. They went to neighbors and got clothes and eventually were spirited out of the country to Cuba. But the interesting thing, and most people don't know this and they should, what they were doing there was making bombs. They were making anti-personnel bombs. They were taking 4 or 5 sticks of dynamite, hundreds of heavy nails, and taping the nails on the outside of the dynamite so that when it exploded, it would send those nails out in every direction, and of course, any one like a bullet. So they would have killed hundreds of people had they been successful. I was very concerned, and at that time, I authorized FBI agents to enter the apartments of 5 members and supporters of the Weather Underground, trying to search for information that would tell us where the next bomb was going off, or what their plans were, or where the fugitives were, intelligence information. This is a technique called surreptitious entry. Some people call it a black bag job, which had been accepted in the FBI in important national security cases for as long as I was in the Bureau.
Surreptitious entry is forbidden by law when used to gather evidence to convict a person for a crime already committed. But when used for the purpose of preventing a crime from being committed, especially in the field of espionage, it is an accepted practice in every civilized country in the world.
In the espionage field, the worst thing you could do would be to get a warrant, because a warrant has to be served. And if you aren't in your apartment when we come to serve a warrant, we have to leave a copy of it attached to your front door. So if you're a Russian spy, what does that tell you? That tells you they're on my tail. I better stop what I'm doing. I better pull back. From the counter-espionage standpoint, you can't let the enemy know what you're doing or how much you know. So
in 1977, the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, under Attorney General Griffin Bell, pressed formal charges against FBI agents in New York, claiming that the use of surreptitious entry into the apartments of members and supporters of the Weather Underground had violated their constitutional rights.
I happen to know that the Civil Rights Division was recommending the indictment of from 50 to 60 FBI agents in New York as a result of this investigation. Well, that was, at that time, was when I felt I had to do something. So I came forward and made a public statement and said that I had authorized those, that if anyone was responsible, I was responsible. Ed Miller, who was another Bureau official, came forward a few days later and said pretty much the same thing. And it was as a result of that that Miller and I were indicted for violation of the civil rights of these individuals.
On April 20, 1978, Mark Felt and Edward Miller arrived at federal court in Washington, D.C. for their arraignment. Former agents awaited their arrival at the steps of the courthouse to demonstrate support. It was clear that more was at stake than the future of 2 men. The FBI itself was on trial by its enemies. From the beginning, federal judge William Bryant demonstrated hostility to the FBI position. At several points within the trial, he even took over the role of prosecutor when the Justice Department attorneys were too slow in doing so. On the last day of the trial, Judge Bryant told the jury to ignore all issues except one. Did or did not the defendants have approval for these entries from the President? This was an incredible instruction because the defense had never claimed that they had been authorized by the President. That procedure had not been instituted by the Justice Department until 5 years after the events in question. By injecting this element at the last possible instant before the jury retired, the fate of the defendants was sealed. On November 6, 1980, Mark Felt and Edward Miller were found guilty of allegedly violating the constitutional rights of American citizens. Their fines were over $8,000, but their total legal costs for defense, an amount raised by FBI agents and friends, exceeded $1 million. By 1975, the Justice Department under the Ford administration had come under the control of Attorney General Edward Levy. since Levy had been a member of the National Lawyer's Office, would be directed toward the destruction of the internal security function of the FBI. Levy inaugurated a series of guidelines for future FBI investigations. Under these guidelines, which were based upon recommendations of the National Lawyers Guild and the American Civil Liberties Union, the FBI could no longer investigate individuals or organizations unless there was already proof that they were planning a criminal act. In a federal lawsuit brought against the government by the Alliance to End Repression, the Justice Department further stipulated that the FBI could not investigate unless the crime was to be committed in the next 48 hours. But without the power to investigate, there is little chance to obtain such proof before the crime is committed. In the past, many bombings, hijackings, and killings have been prevented because the FBI had advance information as a result of prior months and even years of investigation. Now, there is almost no way to anticipate these crimes. The FBI also was told that it could no longer use informants inside terrorist or subversive groups if those informants participated in illegal acts. This sounds reasonable in theory, but in practice, an informant who refuses to participate in the illegal acts of other members of the group soon would be dropped from its innermost circles and would cease to be an informant at all. The man appointed by President Carter to run the FBI was William Webster. When confronted with the guidelines laid down by Attorney General Levy, Mr. Webster expressed satisfaction with them, claiming that they would clarify and simplify the task of the FBI. And simplify they did. Between 1973 and 1979, the number of continuing internal security investigations at the FBI dropped from over 21,000 to 147. That's a reduction of more than 99%. The number of special agents assigned to this work had been reduced to 143, an incredibly small force considering that during that same period, the number of KGB agents under diplomatic cover and operating as journalists or businessmen had grown to almost 2,000. In other words, there are about 14 times as many KGB agents in the United States as there are FBI agents to thwart them. And this is counting just foreign personnel. It does not take into consideration the much larger group of agents with American citizenship, which also is part of the Soviet underground. The CIA also has been weakened by administrative policies established at the top. Between 1964 and 1975, the intelligence operations staff of the CIA was cut back by 40%. Then in 1977, President Carter appointed Admiral Stansfield Turner as director of the CIA. After assuming office, Turner further emasculated the agency by firing 900 of the most experienced intelligence officers that remained. The intelligence agencies of friendly governments abroad are now hesitant to share information with the CIA or the FBI because their confidential documents could be given to the very people who are named in them. This as a result of the Freedom of Information Act. The threat of assassination of CIA officers in other countries, triggered by such organizations as Philip Agee's Covert Action Information Group, has made it difficult to recruit new foreign agents abroad. The morale of the agency is now at an all-time low. Even if a decision were made today to reverse all the crippling policies, it would take many years to rebuild an experienced, efficient, and high-morale intelligence operation. Although protecting the country against its enemies is a function of the federal government, state and local police agencies also have a legitimate interest in subversion, particularly as it may lead to acts of local insurrection or terrorism. And so these agencies also have come under heavy attack from the ACLU and the National Lawyers Guild. The tactic has been to raise the cry of police spying and to institute lawsuits designed to force these agencies to destroy their files and to stop the surveillance of communist activities. In 1973, for example, the New York City Police Department was forced to destroy 80% of its files relating to internal security, including information on Puerto Rican extremists. 2 years later, the Puerto Rican FALN terrorists exploded a bomb in Francie's Tavern, killing 4 and injuring more than 50 people. And on New Year's Eve, 1982, they exploded 4 bombs in Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn.
The FALN has claimed responsibility for more than 100 bombings in the previous 8 years that have killed or injured scores of Americans. Had the New York police been able to continue the surveillance of violence-oriented groups, it is possible that this carnage could have been prevented. In Chicago in 1979, during a trial in which radical leftists were suing the police for investigating them, allegedly because that was a violation of their right to privacy, the federal judge ordered the police to turn over their files on the FALN terrorists to the attorney representing the radicals. The attorney, Jonathan Moore, was a member of the National Lawyers Guild, and 3 of his law partners were members of the above-ground branch of the Weather Underground organization. These files included police analysis of FALN bombing patterns and predictions of future targets which were to be given extra police protection, everything the terrorists needed to know to counter the police. In April of the following year, copies of these police files were discovered in an FALN hideout in Milwaukee. Confidential police files show, among other things, the sources of information. Even when the names of these people have been omitted, often it's easy to determine by other data in the files who the informant is. This results in that person being expelled from the group under investigation, or in some cases, exposed to the danger of physical harm or death. In Los Angeles in 1982, involving a case in which the police were being sued by the ACLU, acting in the name of the Coalition Against Police Abuse, the attorneys demanded a complete list of all ranking ex-officers now employed in the nuclear power industry, a blueprint of all organizational units within the police department showing the detailed function of each, and a list of names of all the officers in each of these units. The intended use of this information can only be imagined, but it clearly would not be for the benefit of law enforcement. Because of the legal harassments of this kind, state and local police agencies have been forced to curtail or to abandon the surveillance of communist activities at the local level. There now are cities in the United States which the president has been advised not to visit because there is insufficient intelligence data to anticipate terrorism or assassination attempts.
If the Weather Underground organization had been allowed to run amok in 1969 and 1970, I don't know how many people might have been killed. But because of my activities and other people's activities, the weathermen had to spend a lot of time trying to determine who the informants were, who the police agents were, and this distracted them from their goals. And I have no doubt that there's a good number of people alive in this country today because of what myself and other people did.
The tools that most policemen use, the tools that the FBI uses, all of a sudden became suspect, attacked.
During the 1970s, John Ashbrook was one of the few members of Congress who fought for a strong internal defense against communism. This statement, given before our cameras in Washington, D.C., is taken from his last public interview before his sudden and unexpected death in 1982.
Again, the government is virtually stripped naked when it comes to this particular aspect. There is no loyalty program. I once, at a hearing, had the opportunity to interrogate the director of the program in the FBI supposedly having loyalty. I said, well, if you found a communist in the government now, what could you do? He said, well, you really can't do anything. Can't ask them questions. They don't keep records. They don't have a loyalty oath. The liberals in the last 15 or 20 years have virtually made government service open to communists by the destruction of the loyalty program and by making it impossible for the FBI or even the Civil Service Commission to make any checks. I would challenge anybody to say that the FBI or the Civil Service Commission could even investigate a communist if you knew one were working for the government. That's how far they've gone. That's how much we've failed.
If you think I'll cooperate with you in any way, you are insane.
Mr. Chairman, I move to abolish this committee. and to seal its records so that no longer do we have to face the spectacle of innocent Americans being
And
terrorized.
furthermore, I say that no agency of this government has any business inquiring into a person's loyalty to the United States. That is McCarthyism and can only lead to the kind of witch hunt.
The purpose of this program has been to review the record of Soviet penetration into the United States government. The lesson of history is that nations fall to communism from the inside. The primary strategy for conquest has not been military invasion, but internal subversion. Yet, in spite of this reality, the United States has allowed all the layers that once existed as protection against internal subversion to be stripped away. First, the important investigative committees of both the House and the Senate were abolished. Then the Internal Security Division of the Justice Department was eliminated. The Subversive Activities Control Board was terminated by lack of funding. The Attorney General's list of subversive organizations is no longer published or even maintained. The counterintelligence units of the armed forces have been severely limited. The FBI has been forced to reduce its internal security activities by over 90%. State and municipal police agencies have all but abandoned their intelligence units. And the CIA has practically ceased to function as a defender of American interests around the world. Communists in our government? Well, to many Americans, the response is, so what, and who cares? What harm can they possibly do to a great and powerful nation as the United States? But recent history already has answered that question. It is the history of American paralysis in world conflict. Having fought a world war supposedly to protect Europe from Germany and to save China from Japan, at the end of that war, we gave the Soviets all of Eastern Europe, Manchuria, the Kuril Islands, the Chinese port of Dairen, the northern half of Korea, and half of Germany. In Yugoslavia, we guaranteed the success of communism by throwing our weight behind the Stalinist Tito in his fight against the pro-Western Mihailovich. After the war, in a project called Operation Keelhaul, we used American troops to round up anti-communist refugees all over Europe to be shipped back to Russia where they faced execution or slave labor in Siberia. This broke the back of the anti-communist movement in Europe. We supported the communist forces of Mao Zedong in their war against Chiang Kai-shek and actively worked behind the scenes to bring about the communization of China. We created the United Nations and staffed the Secretariat with communists from the State Department. We gave the Soviets 3 votes in the General Assembly compared to 1 for us, and agreed further that a Soviet national would always be in charge of UN military activities. We pushed Algeria into the communist orbit by supporting Ben Bella. We helped Castro to power in Cuba and later betrayed the anti-Castro invasion force at the Bay of Pigs. In Korea and Vietnam, we denied our military forces the option of victory. We supported the Sandinista communists in the takeover of Nicaragua. We gave the Panama Canal to a pro-Soviet dictatorship. We have bankrupted ourselves with foreign aid to our most bitter enemies around the world. We have built Soviet industry and have given them high technology for their nuclear strike force. When they could not pay, we canceled their debts and passed them on to the American taxpayer. We condemn anti-communist regimes in Africa and Latin America, allegedly for violations of human rights. But we invite to the White House and then publicly embrace every communist dictator in the world, no matter how bloody his hands. And while freedom fighters throw themselves against Soviet tanks in Hungary, Afghanistan, and Poland, we give solemn assurances that we will not intervene, the very communist governments which the people themselves are attempting to topple. The hard reality is that communism would not be a major force today without the massive help received from the United States government, and that America's retreat from victory since World War II is the result not of a conversion factor.
In a speech before the Roman Senate in the 1st century BC, it was Cicero who said, "A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within." Now, it's not popular today to use the word treason, because that implies what we all dread, a state of war. But the truth is, whether we like it or not, we are at war, and we do have enemies outside our gates and inside who are sworn to our destruction. This is a new kind of war we face. We can't pick up our rifles and rush off to a foreign land to engage in open combat. The battle this time is here, in America itself. And the enemy doesn't wear a uniform or speak a strange language. He is from our country's best families and most prestigious universities. He's not found behind barricades, but in business and science, in the media, the pulpit, the classroom, and in government itself. How many of them are there and exactly where are they? We don't know. And that's the problem. Under present conditions, we have absolutely no way to find out. Now, Americans traditionally are jealous of their liberties, and it's proper that we should be vigilant against government encroachment into our private lives. But we have allowed our enemies to take advantage of this legitimate concern and to use the Constitution as a shield for treason. We must realize that there's no such thing as absolute freedom. For every right, there's an equal and opposite restraint. To have freedom of assembly, we must deny the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. And to have a system of political freedom for all, we cannot allow totalitarians the freedom to destroy the system itself. The Constitution was never intended to be a national suicide pact. And so the first step back to safety and sanity is to restore, as rapidly as possible, all the layers of internal protection that have been stripped away. This must begin in Congress, with legislation to reverse the offending Supreme Court decisions. Then the Freedom of Information Act must be overhauled to exclude internal security cases. The restrictive FBI guidelines need to be revised in favor of national security, and the congressional investigative committees need to be reactivated. Now, in 1981, the Senate did establish a subcommittee on internal security and terrorism under the chairmanship of Senator Jeremiah Denton. Now, that was a good start, but hampered by lack of funds and a limited staff, the committee has not been able to extensively investigate any aspect of subversion inside the United States. It needs to be funded and strengthened. Now, the CIA says that it's a hostile world out there, and we need a CIA to counter the activities of the KGB. But we do not need people running it who think the best way to oppose communism is to set up a socialist regime with communists in it. Of one thing we can be certain. Presidents may come and go, and some may say the right things during election campaigns. But after they assume the office, they'll become engulfed by a giant bureaucracy which will provide them with advice, select the information they receive, and carry out their orders. Until there is a major clean-out in Washington, we can be sure that presidential intentions, no matter how pro-American, will be subverted. Something somehow will go wrong with the best of plans. Until the underground is exposed and routed, there isn't the slightest chance that any president or even the Congress can reverse the disastrous trend of the past 40 years. And if we do not reverse that trend, not only will we push the rest of the world into communism, but we ourselves will become the ultimate prize of Soviet conquest. Now, I know these are extremely hard and unpleasant thoughts, but frankly, it's time for us to face the truth, no matter how ugly it may be. The truth is that the subversion factor is the single most important reality in current world affairs. And the fact that many Americans have never even heard about it is an indication of how successful it has been. If we are to survive in freedom, we must strip the Soviet underground of its constitutional camouflage and also its advantage of secrecy and deception. We must expose its goals, its tactics, and its agents to public view. Finally, when forced to compete in the open on the basis of the honest merit of its ideas, it then will cease to exist in a society of free men.